My name is Dave C, and I'll be the one guiding you through this presentation. We have a lot to cover, so before we get started, I'd like to ask you to do something to make sure that you get the most out of this training. Please turn off your smartphone, email notifications, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and any other distractions. This will help ensure that you don't miss anything important. I promise you that all of those will still be there when we're finished. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's get right into it. This video presentation is broken down into 4 parts. In part 1, you'll learn what WHMIS is and why it's so important. You'll learn about chemicals and their adverse health effects. We'll wrap up part 1 by covering duties and responsibilities of suppliers, employers, and workers. Part 2 covers how chemicals can enter our bodies, as well as hazard classification, WHMIS 1988 symbols, and the new WHMIS 2015 pictograms. In Part 3, we'll cover supplier labels, workplace labels, and WHMIS 2015 safety data sheets. Finally, in Part 4, you'll learn about education and training requirements, safeguarding control methods, and safety guidelines. Okay, let's get started. The Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, commonly referred to as WHMIS, first came into effect on October 31, 1988. It was created to address the rights of Canadian workers to know about health and safety hazards associated with chemicals that they use or may come in contact with in the workplace. In February 2015, Canada aligned WHMIS with the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. GHS was developed as an international initiative to bring global standardization to chemical hazard classification and communication. While the adoption of GHS has resulted in some changes to WHMIS, it offers the same, if not additional protection to workers. GHS is a global system that was developed by the United Nations with the expectation that it would increase safety for employees who work around hazardous chemicals. GHS standardizes how chemical hazards are classified and how the health and safety information associated with hazardous products is communicated. So basically, the same thing that WHMIS was created for, except GHS is meant to standardize this on a global scale. Makes perfect sense considering how much importing and exporting is happening these days. Think about it. Imagine if your company was getting hazardous products from several different countries, and each of those countries had a different system in place for classifying and communicating information about them. This could be really confusing for all of us, and it would be a nightmare to train everyone and stay up to speed on all the systems. GHS is a good thing, and the changes to WHMIS are welcomed. Because there's a transitional period that will last several years, it's likely that workers will encounter elements from both the original WHMIS and the new GHS-aligned WHMIS. It's for this reason that all Canadian workers need to be familiar with both systems in order to properly protect themselves. Here's what the transitional timeline looks like. Phase 1, February 2015 to May 31st, 2017. In this phase, manufacturers, importers, and distributors must comply with WHMIS 1988 or WHMIS 2015. They are not permitted to use a combination of both systems. Phase 2, June 1st, 2017 to May 31st, 2018. In Phase 2, manufacturers and importers must comply with the new requirements. Distributors must comply with WHMIS 1988 or WHMIS 2015. They cannot use a combination of both systems. Phase 3, June 1st, 2018 to November 30th, 2018. In the final phase, manufacturers, importers, and distributors must comply with WHMIS 2015 requirements. They are not permitted to use a combination of both systems. During this period, employers may still see remnants of WHMIS 1988 within their workplace. By December 21, 2018, manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers must all be fully transitioned to WHMIS 2015. Basically, by this date, you should not see any remaining elements of the old WHMIS 1988 system. You probably already know that working with chemicals can be hazardous, but did you know that all chemicals are not the same and they have different characteristics? Before learning about the technical aspects of hazardous products and classifications, let's review some general information about chemicals and their most basic attributes. Solids. The term solid refers to one of the states of matter. Solids are characterized by their rigidity and their resistance to changes of volume and state. Chemicals in a solid state do not flow or completely take the shape of their containers. The density of solids can vary dramatically, which affects their perceived mass and weight. Liquids. The term liquid also refers to one of the states of matter. The particles in liquids are free to flow, so while liquids have a definite volume, they do not have a definite shape. Chemicals in a liquid state flow and completely take the shape of their containers. Gases. The term gas refers to one of the three states of matter. Gases are characterized by their low density. In the gaseous phase, atoms are spread apart as opposed to liquids and solids where atoms are more compact. Some chemicals change into their gaseous state based on environmental variables such as temperature and pressure. Containers. Chemicals can be found in various types of vessels, cans, boxes, drums, bottles, tanks, and pressure vessels. Really, there are no specific packaging requirements which would indicate that a hazardous chemical is contained within. It's for this reason that we must always consider that any type of container or package in the workplace may contain some type of chemical. The potential for hazardous products to be present in the workplace and cause or contribute to adverse health effects is a real concern. Adverse effects can range from minor reversible effects to severe effects which are irreversible. Some health effects are considered acute, meaning that they happen quickly, usually a short time after exposure. Others are considered chronic. This means that they typically occur slowly over time. Examples of acute health effects include damage to tissue, irritation, dry skin, dermatitis, allergic reactions, death. Examples of chronic health effects include cancer, asbestosis, mesothelioma, silicosis, hearing loss, chronic dermatitis, death. WHMIS legislation defines that there are three primary parties which are required to adhere to particular duties and responsibilities pertaining to WHMIS. These include suppliers, buyers, and workers. Suppliers generally manufacture or import hazardous products into the country for the purpose of selling them. They are the companies that your employer buys the chemicals from. Suppliers are required to provide a supplier label for every hazardous product that they import or bring into the country, and provide a safety data sheet for every hazardous material they import or manufacture. In this particular situation, the buyer refers to your employer, the organization that buys the hazardous products for use in its workplace. Your employer is required to ensure that safety data sheets are easy for you and your coworkers to find and read. Ensure that all containers of hazardous materials in your workplace are labeled. And provide training on WHMIS in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee or a health and safety representative. We've all heard the analogy of how the strength of each individual link in a chain will dictate the strength of the entire chain. As a worker, you are a valuable link in this critical chain of health and safety, and also have responsibilities and rights that are very important. As a worker, you're required to participate in WHMIS training and use your knowledge of WHMIS to work as safely as possible. In addition to your WHMIS responsibilities, you also have specific rights that include refusing work that you believe is dangerous, knowing about hazardous materials that you work with or may be exposed to, consulting with the Joint Health and Safety Committee or the Health and Safety Representative. In order to maintain an effective WHMIS program, all three responsible parties must work together as a team. Commitment, communication, and a solid safety culture will ensure that the information that you need is available when it's most important. In order for a chemical to become hazardous to a person's health, it must first contact or enter the body, and it must have some biological effect. The common term that's used for the ways in which chemicals can enter your body is routes of entry. There are 4 primary routes of entry. Let's review each of them to get a better understanding of how chemicals can enter the body and harm you. Inhalation. Inhalation may be the most common way in which hazardous chemicals can enter your body. Dust, mist, fumes, and vapors can be inhaled through your nose or mouth and travel into your lungs, where they can begin to cause damage and even enter into your bloodstream. Ingestion. Chemicals can be easily absorbed through your digestive system. This can occur if you have hazardous materials on your hands while eating or smoking. It's also possible to swallow chemicals if food is left uncovered in areas where there's a risk of exposure to the chemicals. Absorption. Some hazardous materials can also enter your body by passing through your skin. The severity of the harm also varies drastically depending on what type of chemical has contacted you. Some chemicals will cause your skin to become very sensitive, while others may pass directly through the skin and into your bloodstream. Injection. Chemicals can enter the body, and particularly the bloodstream, through lacerations, punctures, or syringe needles. This route of entry is more common in healthcare facilities such as hospitals and clinics. In WHMIS 1988, there are 6 hazard classes, and if you're at all familiar with WHMIS, you may know that they're represented by 8 symbols. 8 because one of the hazard classes has 3 subclassifications. Sometimes workers were confused by this and actually thought that there were 8 classes. WHMIS 2015 is a bit different in a few ways. First, hazards are broken down into 2 groups called hazard groups. Then, within each group, there are several hazard classes. And within each class, there's at least 1 hazard category. And finally, rather than having the symbols that are displayed within a black circle, we have what are referred to as pictograms that are basically an image within a red diamond. Let's break it down and look at these changes a bit more closely. WHMIS 2015 applies 2 major hazard groups, physical and health. And each of the 2 hazard groups has hazard classes that are characterized by specific hazardous properties. Physical hazards group. The hazardous products in this group have been classified according to their physical or chemical properties, such as reactivity, flammability, compressed gases, or corrosiveness on metals. Health hazards group. Hazardous products are classified in this group based on their ability to cause adverse health effects such as acute toxicity, respiratory sensitization, eye irritation, or carcinogenicity. While an environmental hazards group exists in the GHS, it has not been adopted in WHMIS 2015. However, WHMIS 2015 allows manufacturers, suppliers, and employers to include environmental hazards in their labels and safety data sheets whenever possible. Hazard classes are a way of grouping hazardous products together based on their properties. Quite simply, products that have similar properties are grouped in the same classes. Most hazard classes in WHMIS 2015 are common to GHS classes and are used worldwide by all other countries that have adopted GHS, but some are specific to WHMIS 2015. Physical hazard classes. All of the physical hazards that were covered in the Controlled Product Regulations, in which formed part of WHMIS 1988, have been addressed by GHS physical hazard classes, except that the GHS has subdivided the hazards differently. Likewise, all of the GHS physical hazard classes have been adopted in Canada by the Hazardous Product Regulation, except the explosives hazard class. Also, new physical hazard classes such as simple asphyxiants, pyrophoric gases, combustible dust, and physical hazards not otherwise classified have been included in WHMIS 2015 to further increase worker safety and health. Health hazard classes. While WHMIS 2015 health hazard classes subdivide health hazards in a way that's different from the original WHMIS, all of the classes address almost all of the health hazards that were covered in WHMIS 1988 and include some additional types of hazards. The additional hazard classes have been included to further improve worker safety and health. WHMIS 2015 health hazard classes include all of the GHS health hazard classes, along with the biohazardous infectious materials class, which is actually not part of the GHS but was part of WHMIS 1988. Plus, there's a new class called health hazards not otherwise classified. In WHMIS 2015 hazard classification, every hazard class has at least a single category, sometimes referred to as a type. In a few cases, subcategories are also specified. Subcategories are defined with a number and a letter. The category is an indication of how hazardous the product is, or in other terms, the hazard's severity. Category 1 is always the greatest level of hazard within its class. If Category 1 is further divided, Category 1A would be a greater hazard than Category 1B. There are a few exceptions to this rule. For example, for the gases under pressure hazard class, the hazard categories are compressed gas, liquefied gas, refrigerated liquefied gas, and dissolved gas. These classes relate to the physical state of the gas when packaged and do not describe the degree of hazard. Even if you're just entering into the workforce, it's very likely that you've already seen some of the images displayed within symbols and pictograms. These images can sometimes be found on household products that you buy often and possibly use on a regular basis. WHMIS 2015 pictograms are simple graphic images that vividly highlight the types of hazards present in various hazardous products. The standardized pictograms act as visual, easy to understand tools for helping workers to immediately identify the types of hazards present in certain products. A quick glance at a pictogram such as flammable, corrosive, or health hazard will alert the user of the hazardous product's potential dangers and compel him or her to take the necessary precautions. Except for the biohazardous infectious materials pictogram, all of the WHMIS 2015 pictograms are made of a distinctive red square set on one of its points border and have the symbol representing the hazard associated with the product inside the border. Together, the border and the symbol are called a pictogram and are assigned to a specific hazard category or class. Let's review each of the WHMIS 2015 pictograms and WHMIS 1988 symbols to understand what they mean. Gas cylinder. The gas cylinder pictogram or symbol indicates gases under pressure, including compressed gas, liquefied gas, refrigerated liquefied gas, and dissolved gas. All compressed gases are hazardous because of the high pressures inside the cylinders. Even at a relatively low pressure, gas can flow rapidly from an open or leaking cylinder. Flame. This pictogram or symbol indicates that a product is flammable. Flammable substances can ignite very easily and will burn very vigorously when ignited. You must exercise extreme caution while working with or around flammable materials and keep them away from ignition sources at all times. Flame over circle. Materials bearing this pictogram or symbol are considered oxidizing substances. While not flammable on their own, products displaying this pictogram or symbol will provide the oxygen necessary to fuel fires. Oxidizing materials are not limited to one state of matter. They can be in the form of liquids, solids, and gases. Corrosion. This pictogram or symbol indicates that the materials can cause corrosive damage to metals as well as skin and eyes. Damage caused by these chemicals is usually permanent. Significant precautions should always be taken to ensure corrosive materials do not come in contact with unprotected parts of your body. Skull and crossbones. The skull and crossbones indicates that a substance is toxic. Toxic substances have the ability to harm or kill living organisms if ingested or inhaled. Additionally, these substances can cause problems with the respiratory system, leading to breathing difficulties that can result in death. Exclamation mark. This new pictogram lets the user of a product know that the chemical is an irritant. These substances typically cause soreness or redness to the skin and cause it to become irritated. It should be noted that irritant substances do not necessarily have hazards of a low severity, as they have the ability to cause acute toxicity if inhaled or ingested. Health hazards. Substances bearing this pictogram can pose several health hazards and have the ability to physically damage or potentially kill an animal or human. These substances should never be inhaled or ingested under any circumstances. Exploding bomb. This new pictogram and WHMIS 1988 symbol indicate that the materials are explosive or highly reactive. Quite simply, these products can be self-reactive and have the ability to explode if handled improperly. Biohazardous infectious materials. This WHMIS symbol has not changed and means the same thing. These materials are organisms or the toxins which they produce that can cause disease in people or animals. Environmentally damaging. Substances displaying this pictogram have the ability to kill or damage living things within an ecosystem or environment. WHMIS labels are extremely important because they're typically the first indication to a worker that there may be certain hazards while working with a chemical product. WHMIS labels also indicate what precautions need to be taken in order for a worker to protect themselves from illness or injury. WHMIS labels are still required to be added to hazardous products by manufacturers and suppliers before the products are provided to buyers. And still, employers are responsible for making sure that any hazardous products that come into their workplace are properly labeled. Employers are also responsible for making sure that workplace labels are applied when necessary. Workplace labels are different from supplier labels. We'll cover workplace labels a little later. All WHMIS 2015 labels are required to display specific information. The information required to be displayed includes Product Identifier. The product identifier includes the brand name, common name, chemical name, generic name, or the trade name of the product. Signal word. A signal word is used to indicate the severity of the hazard and to alert the user of a potential hazard. There are only two recommended signal words: danger or warning. Warning is used for lower risk hazards, while danger is used for high risk hazards. Some hazard categories actually call for no signal words at all. Hazard statement. These are standardized phrases describing the hazard associated with the product. Examples of these statements include things like fatal if inhaled, extremely flammable gas, causes eye irritation, may cause cancer, and may explode when heated. Precautionary statement. These are standardized phrases describing the measures that need to be taken to prevent or minimize the negative effects caused by improper handling, storage, or exposure to a product. These statements include phrases like keep container tightly closed, protect from sunlight, and wear protective gloves. Pictograms. Labels may contain more than one pictogram depending on the hazards associated with the product. Initial supplier identifier. This includes the name, physical address, and phone number of either the Canadian importer or the Canadian manufacturer. Supplementary information. This can include additional information that can help the user better understand the hazards of the product. This could include things like routes of entry, first aid measures, physical states, and even hazards that aren't yet included in the GHS. Supplier labels must be bilingual. A container can either have one label containing both French and English information, or two separate labels, each containing one of the languages. Workplace labels are different than supplier labels. They are produced in the workplace and, in most cases, by workers. There are a few scenarios where workplace labels will be used. These include when the product is produced in a workplace and used in that workplace, when the contents of a container were transferred from the original container to another container, and when the supplier label is missing or illegible. In all of these scenarios, workplace labels must be applied to the containers. Workplace labels do not require the same information that supplier labels are required to display. The following information must be displayed on a workplace label: the product name, safe handling information, and a reference to the safety data sheet. There are two situations when a workplace label may not be necessary. These include when a hazardous product is poured into a container and will be used immediately, and when a product remains under the control of the person who decanted it. For example, if a person who pours the product into another container will be the only one who will use it, and the product will be used during only one shift, a full workplace label may not be required. In this particular case, the container must still be identified with the name of the product. If the product will not be used immediately, or if more than one person will be in control of the product, a full workplace label is required. One result of the integration of GHS into WHMIS is that the original material safety data sheets have been updated and renamed safety data sheets. Replacing material safety data sheets with safety data sheets helps to improve the classification of hazards, improve employer involvement in workplace safety, ensure safe handling of hazardous products, and enhance emergency response. Still, there are several similarities between the two types of documents. For instance, they are both typically written by product manufacturers and suppliers, but may be prepared by employers whenever products are created and used exclusively in the workplace. Similarly, both documents contain hazard information and are more detailed than product labels. More importantly, both documents are resources and guides for workers and workplaces and help with identification of hazards and promoting precautionary measures when dealing with various products. While there are a number of similarities between the two documents, the 16-section SDSs contain different information and present the safety data in a different format to that of the 9-section MSDS. SDSs have a more comprehensive hazard classification criterion, including new classes of hazards that make the physical hazard criteria more consistent with the TDG regulations. They also employ a more standardized language and utilize a new standardized format. The biggest difference is that it's much easier for workers to find the information that's relevant to them using this format. WHMIS 1988 material safety data sheets are required to be updated after every 3 years. WHMIS 2015 safety data sheets must be updated within 90 days after any significant information becomes available that changes the class of the hazardous product or impacts the protective measures required to be taken while working with it. WHMIS 2015 requires manufacturers to communicate such information to every purchaser of the product in writing. All of the information contained within an SDS doesn't apply to everyone, and their segmented nature has made it much easier for workers to find information that's relevant to them without having to dig through a pile of a product's technical aspects that's not useful to them. Let's look at the sections that are most relevant to you as a worker and see what's contained within them. Section 4. First Aid Measures. Section 4 shows first aid measures by route of entry as well as the most important symptoms and health effects. Section 5. Firefighting Measures. Section 5 communicates the firefighting measures including proper extinguishing media, specific hazards, and specific information and precautions for firefighters. Section 6. Accidental Release Measures. This section tells what to do in the event that the product was accidentally released and includes information about required protective equipment for cleanup, emergency procedures, and containment for cleanup. Section 7. Handling and Storage. This section is extremely important as it contains precautions for safe handling and guidelines for the safe storage of the product. This section should always be thoroughly reviewed by workers prior to using a product. Section 8. Exposure Controls and Personal Protection. Similar to Section 7, this section of an SDS is extremely important and should always be reviewed by a worker before using a product. It contains exposure limits, required engineering controls, and the personal protective equipment the users of the product must use in order to stay safe. Adequate education and training is fundamental in ensuring that WHMIS works. Any employer who has hazardous products in their workplace must ensure that workers who may be exposed to those products are adequately trained. There are two types of training: general WHMIS training and workplace-specific training. General WHMIS training is also commonly referred to as education, and the workplace-specific portion, training, hence the term education and training. Both education and training, or general and workplace-specific training, are extremely important and must be incorporated into a company's overall WHMIS training program. Topics typically covered in general WHMIS training or WHMIS education include what WHMIS is, duties and responsibilities, how chemicals enter the body, adverse health effects, labels and what they're required to display, pictograms, how to read safety data sheets, and general safety guidelines. Topics typically covered in workplace-specific training include specific safety precautions, emergency procedures, handling and use requirements, required PPE, where to find it and how it's used, specialized policies and procedures, the meaning of all signal words and hazard statements on labels and safety data sheets in the workplace. When reviewing the topics, it's easy to see that both education and training are required to adequately protect workers and establish a complete WHMIS training program. Working with or in close proximity to hazardous products doesn't necessarily mean that you're destined to get injured or ill. In fact, if you take the proper safety precautions, you can virtually eliminate the risk altogether. The first step is knowing the hazards, the second, knowing what precautions to take, and finally, taking those precautions at all times without exception. In this final part, we'll be covering some common safety precautions that must be taken in order to protect yourself. It's important to remember that each workplace is unique and that all possible hazards and safeguarding methods may not be covered in this presentation. If you're ever uncertain of a hazard or what safety precautions you're required to take, speak to your supervisor immediately. The hierarchy of safeguarding controls is a system used in industry to minimize or eliminate exposure to hazards, in this case, chemical hazards. The hazard controls in the hierarchy are, in order of decreasing effectiveness, elimination or substitution, engineering, administrative, personal protective equipment, hygiene. Let's review each of the safeguarding control categories in a little more detail to get a better understanding of how they protect us. Elimination or substitution. If a process that uses a hazardous chemical can be eliminated entirely, then the hazard will effectively no longer exist. This can be done using several methods, including automating a process, thereby eliminating the need for an employee to come in contact with a hazardous product. Similarly, if substitutions can be made which mitigate the hazard entirely, the control is equally as effective as elimination. Engineering controls. Engineering controls are used to remove a hazard or place a barrier between the worker and the hazard. Well-designed engineering controls can be highly effective in protecting workers and will typically be independent of worker interactions to provide this high level of protection. For example, engineered ventilation systems can provide exceptional protection from certain chemical exposure. Administrative controls. Administrative controls include work practices, policies, procedures, training, and other guidelines that individuals must follow. While these may be less effective than eliminating the hazard altogether, they are an extremely important element in reducing the likelihood of an incident occurring. Hygiene. Practicing good personal hygiene reduces the probability of hazardous materials entering the body and even carrying the substances outside of the workplace. You should always wash thoroughly after being in situations where a possibility of exposure exists. PPE should not be worn outside of your work area to reduce the likelihood of transferring any harmful substance into other environments. Hygiene is actually not included as a separate item in most hierarchies and is usually considered an administrative control. We've included it in a separate category to emphasize its importance in reducing the potential for injuries and illnesses due to chemical exposure. Personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment, PPE, can be considered a last line of defense in protecting oneself from the hazards associated with exposure to harmful chemicals. PPE includes important items such as safety glasses, respirators, gloves, face shields, coveralls, and safety boots. PPE must fit properly, be maintained regularly, and all employees should be trained in its proper storage, maintenance, and use. Now that we know about the safeguarding control methods, let's review some general safety guidelines that must be followed in order to protect yourself while working with hazardous products. Ensure that compressed gas cylinder caps are in place and secured prior to and during transport. Always use properly designed carriers for transporting and handling compressed gas cylinders. Cylinders must be stored in a cool, dry place and should always be secured to prevent tipping or falling. Ensure that connections are properly secured before attempting to open valves on compressed gas cylinders, and ensure that all valves are closed before removing connections. Avoid ignition sources such as flames, smoking, sparks, and hot sources when working with flammables. Avoid oxidizers when working with flammable materials as they provide oxygen and will promote burning. Flammable materials should only be stored in approved storage containers and cabinets. Oxidizing substances must always be kept away from ignition sources. Always wear the personal protective equipment that your employer requires you to wear when working with hazardous chemicals. Never make direct contact with toxic or corrosive materials. Materials should always be handled and stored in designated areas only. Ensure that hazardous materials are cleaned up and disposed of properly, so that traces are not left in areas and on surfaces where they can harm you. Cleanup and disposal requirements can be found on a product's SDS. Ensure that all containers and storage devices are closed securely to avoid accidental release. Always follow workplace-specific policies, procedures, and guidelines. If you don't understand a hazard or how to work safely, ask your supervisor immediately. Never take shortcuts. Ensure that all containers of hazardous materials contain a proper label. Always review a product's safety data sheet prior to using the product. Do not use a chemical unless an up-to-date safety data sheet is available for review. You now know about WHMIS, chemical hazards, and more importantly, how to protect yourself. Now it's up to you to take what you've learned and consistently apply it to your daily duties so that you and your coworkers stay safe. As usual, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time.